Today on Eye on Northwest Politics, a virtual holiday weekend feast. I serve up a sit-down with Multnomah County District Attorney Nathan Vasquez. How is he handling the county's biggest legal challenges 1 year into the job? Plus, looking back on 2 lifetimes on the air. I joined Jeff Gianola to reflect on the stories that kept us coming back all these years. Eye on Northwest Politics starts now. Welcome to this holiday weekend edition of Eye on Northwest Politics. I'm Ken Boddie. This weekend, we are focusing on gratitude and reflection, 2 big themes for Thanksgiving. First, I got the opportunity to sit down with Nathan Vasquez as he reflects on 1 year on the job as Multnomah County's district attorney. We spoke before a crowd last week at City Club. The conversation is wide-ranging, from reducing gun violence to the surging cases from the mass protests outside the ICE facility. Here's some of that conversation. Let's talk about the issue that's been on the minds of many people in Multnomah County over the past couple of months, ICE. U.S. Border Patrol has just reported 560 ICE arrests in Portland this past month. That's a major uptick from previous months. We've also seen ICE and Portland police arresting demonstrators at the ICE facility in South Waterfront. Just kind of delineate who's arresting who, what are they getting charged with, and what courts do they end up in?
Well, first I'm going to start off by saying thank you to everyone for being here. I just really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. I feel so lucky to have such an experienced moderator to help me through these really are really challenging topics, and so important that we have this conversation. So let's jump in. When we talk about who's prosecuting who and what's going on, is that in this particular instance we have pretty, I don't know if we want to call it stationary, but we have a set protest that is occurring down at the South Waterfront in front of this, federal facility. So the way that that it gets divided up is that when we have crimes that are, occurring either against a federal agent or against this federal property, the U.S. Attorney's Office in this particular instance has been very clear that they are going to handle those. That's, that has been communicated to me, and it's been what we're seeing occurring. So, in other words, if when we started out, my office started taking some of these cases. There was some, there were individuals that set fire to the gate, for example. We took those cases on. But the U.S. Attorney's Office has kind of stepped up and said, no, we want to take those on, we want to deal with that. So they have kind of stepped into that space, if you will. And so an easy example is if someone threw a brick and it broke out a window there, the federal officers, you'll see, they're going to come out, they're going to take someone into custody, and they're going to be processed through the federal system in the federal courthouse. Now, what happens when you have something like this that gains lots of national attention, and I'm in a situation where, thankfully this isn't my first rodeo. I've been doing this for, like we heard, about 25 years. I handled protests beginning really early on in my career, on into the 2016 Trump election. We had a lot going on then, into 2018, into 2020. And so I've seen kind of all the different iterations that we've had so far. And this is, it's a slight variation on what we've seen in the past. It's a lot more mellow, despite what the national news, Fox News, says. This is something that is, there's a situation now, though, it's gotten a lot of attention, and you have people on the far right, and you have people on the far left, and they are coming together out in front of the ICE facility, having a lot of, we'll call it political discourse. And sometimes that discourse turns into, some physical altercations. And that is happening on the streets of Portland. That is that is really a Multnomah County or state of Oregon problem, and that's my responsibility. So when you see an assault occur, when they, when 2 individuals start fighting and wrestling around, there are various crimes that can occur there. And so that's where my office is stepping in and saying, hey, we just want to keep the peace.
You made reducing gun violence and homicides a campaign focus. It's almost a year. You're coming up on a year now that you've been in office. It seems like we've seen an uptick in reported shootings lately. What are your efforts in that arena, and have you had any success in reaching that goal?
Yeah. No, another key area that I talked a lot about and I spent a lot of time on, and I'll say that from the beginning, as a prosecutor who spent so much time with families that have lost a loved one to gun violence, this has been something that is just, it's deeply important to me. And I'll always be the first to say, one death from gun violence is too many. It is. Throughout my career, I saw there were about 20 to 30 homicides in Portland a year. That was kind of, for 2 decades, it was like that. In 2020, it started skyrocketing. In about 2022, we hit the high mark. In 2022, 2023, to about 100 plus a year. And it was devastating for the families to be out there. The office, it was this huge, strain on my office because, my deputy DAs are out there, responding. At that time, it was me out responding to these cases. And, it is hard to even put in words how difficult and tragic it is to go, walk this horrible journey with a family that has suffered such a terrible, terrible loss. And so to answer your question about how is it now? Well, we started to see a little bit of a decline last year. And I'll say that it's interesting that when you look at Portland compared to other major cities around the West Coast and around the United States, the other cities dropped off the table. They saw a spike like Portland, but then they saw a very huge drop. I mean, some cities were down to like 6 homicides a year, in the teens. Cities like Seattle, like San Diego, like cities that it was always shocking that Portland lagged so far behind. Right now, I was just talking to my team because it's something we talk about, just on a regular, continual basis. We're at about 46, somewhere in that range. It's like 43 to 46. There's always a little different in how certain groups count certain numbers. But that's where we're at. So last year we were at 75. So we're seeing it come down. Recently there's been a spate of violence, and it's very concerning. So, from the very beginning, I have set out, and here are the things I've done. Certainly seeking legislation that's a kind of some long-term fixes, but in the short term, we have deputies dedicated that go out with our officers, are working on these cases. We've also leaned heavy into what's called ceasefire. And ceasefire model, thankfully we saw expanded out of not just Portland, but it's also in Gresham now. This is a community effort in which they are working with individuals that are high risk for gun violence, but they're working to try to prevent that gun violence, to say, how can we interrupt?
We've talked a lot in the past, you and I, about the public defender crisis and the fact that we don't have enough public defenders out there. How does it affect what you do in the DA's office, and are we getting more public defenders online?
Well, Ken, I've got a lot of strong feelings about this one. So, and I'll tell you, I take a different approach than really most everyone that talks about this issue. And I've encouraged lots of folks out there to really take a hard look at this, because I do not believe this is a shortage in the way that we think about. And I'll tell you why. One is, from a very basic standpoint, prior to this crisis occurring, the crisis actually coincides with when the defense attorneys in the state of Oregon changed their contract, and all of a sudden we were in a crisis. So before the contract change, we had actually more criminal cases coming in. We had around 12,000 plus cases, and we had no crisis. And we had, I'm going to just tell you this fact, a lot less defense attorneys. Now, they changed the contract. We've continued to have a buildup in attorneys, and I'm going to get back to that point. But we've also had a lot less criminal cases. We're down around 7,000, 8,000 criminal cases. So 4,000 less cases, more attorneys, and still a crisis. In fact, what happened this past year is, in the past couple of years, here's the things that have happened. Because around the state, people are looking at this saying, this is unacceptable. Certainly I'm one of them. Because I want every individual out there that needs an attorney that can't afford one to have one, or I can't do my job.
Most of us have an idea of what happens in the DA's office by watching television and Law and Order. Would you tell us how the real world differs from what the television version is?
It's another fantastic question. Law and Order was one of my absolute favorites, and certainly I've had the, I would say, honor and privilege of working in court, giving closing arguments and that's all very, it's exciting, fun, interesting. Here's how it differs. 90% of our work is on how do we work out and resolve a case that's as beneficial to parties as it can be. And that's a lot of hard work about pulling through and saying, what is the crisis that brought that person before the criminal justice system? What are the circumstances surrounding that? We're looking at the aggravating, mitigating factors. We're looking at mental health evaluations. A massive portion of what I deal with are people suffering with various mental health issues. And then another huge portion is, substance use disorder issues. And so we're looking and carefully picking through, and because I am a believer, and I will always put this forward to say, if we're doing our job the best way possible, we are doing it in a manner that gets people out of the criminal justice system.